To what extent do you think that there is a purposeful intelligence in nature that's at work here that we don't quite understand?
Well, I would fully concur with that. I mean, that's one of the things I learned, and that's a good way to put it because it leaves it deliberately vague, a purposeful intelligence. It doesn't try to name it. Is it the spleen talking to you? That's how people start thinking. How do I objectify that? How do we control that? Maybe can we commodify that, make some money out of that, that sort of thing. You see what humans do with that sort of thing, but a purposeful intelligence. That's why I said something in us that knows us better than we know ourselves. Absolutely. Jung wrote in his memoir, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, which I think is something everybody ought to read. It's his spiritual biography. It doesn't say, everything he did in the outer world, but it's talking more about his inner life and its development. At the end of the book, it's the next to the last paragraphs, he's asked by the person he's talking to, well, what's your grand summation of life? And he says, really, I have no major conclusions other than to say two things. One, I feel I'm the same person I was back then as a child, with all the outer changes. That there's a continuity in my mode of being, is his phrase, that has not changed. That's the self, capital S, not the ego, the self doing its thing. It's the organ of or the engine of our continuity and developmental nature. And secondly, he said, and something, leaving it deliberately vague, has been guiding me all this way.
Okay, I'm joined here by Dr. James Hollis, and we're going to be exploring some of the key ideas from his work over the years. So to get started, Jim, a question that I found particularly interesting that I've heard you share is that the final question in life is, what is wanting to live in this world through me? Can you maybe expand on the significance of this question to you?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, you have to ask how we gain a sense of ourself. And the infant is constantly looking in the mirror of its parent's eyes to see how it's being reflected. Am I of value myself? Or am I insufficient? Or am I allowed to cry here or ask for something? Or 1,000 questions that are tied to its well-being and survival. And so we tend to identify, because we're helpless and tiny and dependent, on the conditions of the world around us. And fortunately, we're creatures of adaptation, so that's how this species has survived through the millennia. But the paradox is, the more I'm adapting to that outer world, maybe the less connected I am to what is central to me, or what is at core my own nature, my own instinctual presence in this world. And so, and this is a generalization, but the task of the first half of life is to mobilize enough ego strength to step into the world, to leave our parents, to step into the world. And we know that making a big body doesn't mean the person's an adult psychologically, but from a certain age on, we're supposed to act as if we know who we are, what we're doing, and we're acting consciously and responsibly, and so forth. But of course, inside is this frightened child who's still trying to figure out what's going on here. Am I safe? And what do I need to do to, stay out of harm's way and get my needs met and win your favor, and so forth. And so we do have to develop ego strength to step into the world, create relationship, career, perhaps parent, civil responsibilities, etc. But at some point in one's life, and it may not occur in everyone's life, comes the question, so why am I here really? Who am I here really? What's this all about really? Because you can't trust your first response there. This was something that was anticipated in Tolstoy's The Death of Ivan Ilyich, John Johnson, so to speak, published in 1885. So that long ago, he's perceiving that people get scripts from their family and their culture religion, education, etc., that define who they are, what they're supposed to do and be to be acceptable, to be included. And so this was a person who did all the right things. Married the right person, went to the right school, practiced his profession, rose up the career ladder, developed his resume, et cetera, et cetera. And then towards the end of his life, although he wasn't that old at the time, he develops this pain in his side that doesn't go away. And he realizes shortly that he's dying. And he realized for the first time he hasn't really lived. He doesn't know why he's been there. And of course, no one wants to talk with him about that because that's his problem, not their problem. It's not relevant to them. And only in his last 3 days, full of suffering, does he have an honest conversation about this life, this journey, this purpose, this meaning. Why am I here? With an illiterate peasant who was assigned to his health care. And then he dies. And the world just rolls on the way it did before. Now, I think Tolstoy was tapping into this idea that there is something unique to each person. There is something that they are meant to live. That's their inner daimon, to use the old Greek term. You know, that's your inner spirit connection to the bigger picture. And because we're adaptive, and again, we have to be to some degree to survive and fit in, we get in our own way. We lack permission to take that seriously. We might even rationalize or have rationalized force. That's narcissism or self-absorption. When in not, it's really respect for the soul. And I think the big task of the second half of life, and again, I'm saying that very loosely, less chronologically than psychologically. For Ivan, his second half of life was the last 3 days of his life, is when you start asking the question, I've tried to answer what the world wants from me, meet their expectations with my responses for good or ill. But what is the soul asking me? And when I use the word soul, I mean that deepest part of us. It's the literal meaning of the word psyche. What is the psyche asking of me? And then the question is, what is it that is meant to be unfolding from me as a human being? We all live partial and truncated lives. We live these lives of adaptation of various scripts and roles. And I'm not saying they're all bad by any means. Socialization is, necessary to some degree. But the overly socialized animal becomes, in a way, a stranger to himself or herself. So then the question is, what is wanted in the world through me? As a person, it doesn't have to be some scientific invention. It doesn't have to be a cure for disease. It doesn't have to be an artistic product. It means just stepping in a more authentic way to your partner, to your children, and so forth. Jung said once, the greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parent. And I think that's very sobering. That says to every parent, if you're living timidly, if you're living constrained, if you're living without permission to have your own journey, your children are going to be blocked there too. Is that what you want to give them? Or they'll be spending their life trying to break through that limitation in some way. And so life involves a risk. It involves a departure of some kind, a place where you step out from the protective adaptations once necessary, but later are constrictive to a person. Actually, that's the single most important thing I learned through my years of analysis in Zurich when I was at midlife, was that my protective strategies, such as they were, had become constricting agents in my life. In other words, what we've become is now our chief obstacle for further growth and development. So stepping beyond that, stepping into the large unknown is of course intimidating. But if we don't do that, we've lived small and adaptive lives. I don't say that judgmentally. I say it with sympathy. We live small and adaptive lives because they're safer that way, and it's a way of protecting the fragility of one's psychological truth. But something inside of us knows better. That's what psychopathology is. If you just look at the etymology of that word for a moment, psyche, soul, pathos, suffering, logos, expression. psychopathology, which all of Western medicine and much of psychology said, well, how quickly to get rid of that? Take this pill, do this or that, rather than ask the question, which we ask in analytic psychology, why has it come? What is it asking of us? Why has the psyche autonomously withdrawn its approval and support from the places where the executive function up here, the boss I think I am, is trying to execute its agenda? But something in the psyche is not cooperating. And somewhere we have to submit ourselves to that inquiry. What is it in us that knows us better than we know ourselves? And I experienced this personally. By age 30, I'd achieved all the things that I wanted in life, and everything was flowing smoothly the way it was supposed to flow. And then by the time I was 35, I was pulled under in a very deep depression, which is what sent me to my first hour of therapy. And there were issues I needed to address, which I vaguely was aware of, but not as explored as they required exploration. So I'm sorry if I'm being long-winded, but the task of the first half of life is to some degree stepping into the world, managing a life as best we can with all of its flaws and setbacks and heartaches, perhaps. And then to really ask the question, but what is this journey about? And I don't think it's about self-aggrandizement. I don't think it's about happiness. Actually, happiness is very transient, very contextual. Happiness comes when you are in right relationship to your own soul, even if, you know, it's in a venue of difficulty or even suffering. In other words, I would have never imagined as a young person that in the second half of my life, I would devote my energies, my daily work, to working with people who are suffering hour after hour after hour, of clients who are in difficult times in their lives. But I can also say nothing makes me happier than to be part of a serious conversation that comes out of those encounters with individuals along life's highway. We all have the same problems, generically speaking, but we can learn from each other, support each other, but each of us has to find our own path. And ultimately to respect that there's something, again, inside of each of us that knows us better than we know ourselves. And when we get off course, it begins to correct us and to challenge us. And then is the invitation to have a very deep conversation around the meaning of your journey. And I think everybody has that appointment in life and multiple times along the way, but not everybody keeps the appointment, as we know.
Well, there's so much in there. Um, for me, the thing that's really, I suppose, jumping out at me is we're sort of, in essence, we're sort of saying here that the first half of life is characterized by the adaptations of the culture that you're in, and your desires are very much shaped by the culture. And then the second half of life, it's more about tuning into what nature is trying to express through you. I know I'm being very simplistic here, but I'm just trying to provide I suppose, a summary.
Mhm.
And for me, the thing I'm really curious about, particularly from your point of view, because I know you experienced a really dark depression in I think you're around 35 or so. Do you think the breakdown is necessary to enter the second half of life, or is it possible to go into this proactively and consciously?
Well, I think it doesn't have to pathologize as it did for me. And by the way, the word psychopathology etymologically, forgive my didacticism here, means the expression of the suffering of the soul. See, so in that case, once you realize that, then it's not about how quickly do I eliminate the symptoms. I think, oh, that's an important question, isn't it? The soul has shown up here. The soul is asking to have a conversation with me. Maybe it's time for me to stop running and, stop and pay attention here. So there are certainly individuals who naturally move through these phases into the next phase of their journey. Um, I remember as a child asking large questions about life, and I think children do, most children do. And yet then through the adaptation and the routinization of life, we become these provisional personalities, meaning it's never quite real. We always think, well, someday it'll make sense to me, or I'll figure out who I am and what I'm supposed to do here, but then before you know it, a few decades have passed and your life's about over. And some people have that permission. Depends a lot on what kind of feedback or mirroring they got in childhood. Do you have permission to feel what you really feel? Do you have permission to take your dreams seriously? Do you have real permission? Not in a selfish, narcissistic way, but in a humbling way that says, this is who I am. This is what I'm meant to live. Or do you have to fit in or be comfortable in doing this? Or do you have to be safe? Or are you afraid of risking, some of your familial ties or your partnership or something like that? Stakes can get very high. And for most people, that's why it has to break through, if it's ever going to, in some, pathogenic way, as it happened with me. But some people, it's true, have that core sense of permission, and they're allowed to undertake this journey, a journey that evolves and changes along the way, of course. I mean, there's a time when our basic individuation imperative is learn how to talk, learn how to toddle, there are other times where we learn how can I be responsible enough to be an effective partner in my commitment to this other person and that sort of thing. Those are all important milestones on this journey and part of our growth and development. I'm not talking about some sort of mystical revelation that comes to a person, although rarely that's how it occurs. But there comes a point where having gotten to the point where you've created a life, if you will, with all of its rough edges and so forth, but you still have to say, but what is this about really? And what am I to do with that? And so I will just add further personally. For me as a child, I was deeply grateful for teachers when I was in primary school, because I knew somehow they were my pathways to a larger world. My parents had been devastated by poverty, and I was growing up during World War II. And while I was personally safe, I knew the world was far from safe, and I knew the world was dangerous and full of grief. And I was grateful for them. And my father was pulled out of eighth grade at age 13 and sent to work in a factory the rest of his life before child labor law. And my mother was a secretary later in life. And for them, life was hardship and trying to last to the next paycheck, to see if we can pay for the rent this month, that sort of thing. And I sympathize for them, I grieve for them, and I thank them for things. I also knew I had some kind of other journey, and their advice to me, and it was well meant, was stay here. Don't go out there. You'll just get your heart broken out there. We'll take care of each other. Let's circle the wagons and hold off, the onslaughts that life is going to present to us. And something in me just knew, no, I have to go somewhere. And so when I was 18, I left for university days and never went back except, to visit, kind of normal sorts of visits to family and so forth. Now, what that was in me, I don't know. I know it was in them. I saw glimpses of it. But I also know the crushing circumstances of their social setting and situation basically suppressed all of that. They didn't have permission. I did not have permission for my own life for the first phase, even though I made the break, as I just mentioned, to get away. I think that was part of what was the psyche was wanting to bring to the surface. Are you really living the journey that makes most sense to you, that really is confirmed by something deep within you, rather than conforming to the world of expectations that are always around you? And so, again, when I started in training at midlife in Zurich, I didn't expect to change my career at that time. I was a college professor, and I enjoyed teaching. I still do. But as I started working with clients and I worked in a psychiatric facility, I found that the conversation there somehow felt more real. And it was something challenging about all of the things that really matter in life, and taught me things like how much fear governs our lives, and how we develop our personality operation system around protecting ourselves from our various fears. And that's quite understandable. But how they become themselves cells in which we live constricted lives, then that's the kind of thing that started revealing itself to me at midlife. So I haven't forgotten your question. Sometimes people can go through a natural phase of development. I don't know that I know any of those people, but I hear they exist. The people that I have as friends and people that I see in my clinical practice usually have had some serious collisions in their life, whether externally or internally or both. And what it means for them and what it's asking of them is part of the work we do together.
Yeah, yeah, so interesting. So you've said a few things there, like the psyche withdrew its consent, and the psyche is autonomous, and things like this. And what I'm really curious about your journey, Jim, is to what extent do you think that there is a purposeful intelligence at work here? And when I ask this, I'm asking because you went into the depths of depression,
Mhm.
that was a, a turning point in your life's journey that led you on a completely different path. And that path, because you sort of answered the summons, as I've heard you put it, that has led you to um, helping a lot of people in the world and changing consciousness for the better for a lot of people. So, it's a long-winded question, but it's really, to what extent do you think that there is a purposeful intelligence in nature that's at work here that we don't quite understand?
Well, I would fully concur with that. I mean, that's one of the things I learned. Um, and that's a good way to put it because it leaves it deliberately vague, a purposeful intelligence. It doesn't try to name it. Is it the spleen talking to you? That's how people start thinking. How do I objectify that? How do we control that? Maybe can we commodify that, make some money out of that, that sort of thing. You see what humans do with that sort of thing, but a purposeful intelligence. Um, that's why I said something in us that knows us better than we know ourselves. Absolutely. Jung wrote in his memoir, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, which I think is something everybody ought to read. It's his spiritual biography. It doesn't say, everything he did in the outer world, but it's talking more about his inner life and its development. At the end of the book, it's the next to the last paragraphs, he's asked by the person he's talking to, well, what's your grand summation of life? And he says, really, I have no major conclusions other than to say two things. One, I feel I'm the same person I was back then as a child, with all the outer changes. That there's a continuity in my mode of being, is his phrase, that has not changed. That's the self, capital S, not the ego, the self doing its thing. It's the organ of or the engine of our continuity and developmental nature. And secondly, he said, and something, leaving it deliberately vague, has been guiding me all this way. And I thought, that's about what I would say also. I don't profess to know what that is. Many people would say, well, that's the will of God. And maybe that's the case. I don't personify it that way. I would simply say something inside. Well, the Greeks used the idea of the daimon, Daimon, not to be confused with demon. Daimon is that guiding spirit that you have, the tutelary spirit that's an intermediary between you and the gods, as it were. And as Socrates said, I don't speak. The ego's the instrument of this, but I'm not speaking. The daimon is speaking through me. That in a way, well, some people have put it this way. We're in transient bodies, but we have some spiritual manifestation. We embody the spirit in this world, and spirit is energy, and energy is invisible, although you certainly can see its impact here. That something in you is your unique mode of being in the world. It's often occurred to me that our lives are very tiny and small when you compare it to the big picture of the cosmos, of course. But in some way, we're to bring this small chip that we are into the totality of being, because the whole mosaic is diminished as individual chips are not present. You see, that's not about me. That's not about being rewarded or seen or validated. It's about serving a purpose that may very well lie outside, any ego understanding of what this journey's been about. And when I was young, I was wanting to know what the answers were, as most people do. I thought when I went to college, maybe that I would learn, what the people who were wise had to say. And of course, the more I learned, the more confused I got, and so forth. And slowly I learned, it's not about any answer, because any answer you have today will be outgrown by tomorrow or the next day, when you have better questions or better instruments to measure all of this. And so I'm perfectly comfortable now with not knowing anything, and with, respecting the mystery. And I know every day I'm here to show up the best I can and bring to the encounters of life as much integrity as I can manage and as much courage as I can manage. And some days go well and some days don't. And that's the human story. But you just do your best. That's all you can do.
There's so many things, that are coming to mind that I could ask. It's a bit annoying actually because there's only a limited finite amount of time. But okay, the first thing is you mentioned there about showing up with as much integrity and as much courage as possible each day, and that's really important. And to me, that's been my experience of life as well. When I kind of align myself with these kind of principles or almost natural laws, life tends to go well. And that's a weird thing, but that seems to be the way our world works. Truth is the same thing. If I'm honest, there's a good result out of that. And the other way too. So it's like, to me, there seems to be some kind of laws at work here that we don't quite understand, but when we work with them, life goes well. Any thoughts or comments on that?
Sure, sure. It goes better, not so much always in the outer world. Life's still going to hammer you, but something inside feels the rightness of your journey. That's what makes the difference. And reportedly, because when I was in Zurich, Jung had already passed away, of course, but he reportedly said that every class there should begin with the tale of the rainmaker from China. And briefly, this province had been in a drought for a long time. They tried everything that they knew to produce rain. So they sent away for a venerable rainmaker from another province. And he comes after a long journey, and he walks around and absorbs the atmosphere. And he says, prepare me a place to stay. And he sits in this little hut for 3 days and 3 nights. Heavens open up, it pours. They say, well, what was your secret? And he said, I came to your land and I felt your disorder. So I knew that I had to set my house in order. When my house is in order, the world tends to order itself around me. And Jung said that's the essence of what depth psychology is about, is set your own house in order. And unless you do that, it's always going to be disordered around you. Now, there are no guarantees in this, but I've found, as you've experienced, you just told us, that things tend to go better when you're operating within your own truth, whatever it is, respectful of others, the rights of others. This is not narcissism again. It's respect for what is real in here, and respect for what's real in the other person. So There's no happy highway to sustained absence of conflict. For example, if I think all's fine with my world, well, then probably I'm ignoring that just down the street at a hospital, there are people suffering, or that there's injustice going on all around me. And I need to be mindful of that to help balance my self-absorption. And I need to be part of, what addresses the issues around us as best I can, and in a small way I can. The first half of life, I was an academic, and I loved it, and I still love teaching. It's the one thread that's been a constant. That's why we're meeting today. Whether I do it in books or in the analytic hour or in a class or whatever, I'm still a teacher. That's what the daimon wants for me. I wanted to be a major sports figure when I was a child, but the daimon said, "Well, the gods have something else in mind for you," and I'm grateful for that. But I also came to realize that, being present to others, knowing you can't fix them, but together you can perhaps produce a larger life. You can produce a more authentic response to the sufferings that life is bringing you, is what you're called to do. So even when I write a book, that's the audience I have in mind. The folks that are struggling to make sense of their life and maybe have needed permission to ask those kinds of questions. And one of the things I've tried to do in years of travel and writing and so forth is to give validation, because many, many thoughtful people feel, I don't fit in. I'm different. There must be something wrong with me. And I would say quite the contrary. There's something right with you that you've asked certain kinds of questions, realize you don't fit in the collective responses. As Jung said, the larger the group, the lower the level of consciousness. And, there's a community of exiles. They don't form political parties and they don't form religious groups, but you're not alone in your aloneness in two different ways. There are many like you, and from time to time, you can connect with a person in that way, and you will have a deeper conversation, which is what I came to appreciate in therapy, that it was a deeper conversation. The one in the classroom was wonderful, but the one in therapy is more real somehow, at least was for me, is for me. And secondly, that you realize there is an ongoing need for a conversation with something inside. The old saying has it that the only cure for loneliness is solitude, which is paradoxical. Because when you're alone, you're not alone because there's a conversation with that other presence inside. We've called the daimon, or whatever term you want to use. And that tells you through the feeling function, through your energy systems, through your dreams, through your symptoms, through your aspirations, that this is what the world, or the soul rather, is asking of you. And it may bring you into conflict at times with the world, but you have to find your way through that thicket. Look at, for a quick example, I'm nearing 85, and I came across recently a statistic that indicated that if you reach 80, 6 years of your life will have been spent dreaming, which is extraordinary. Not sleeping, that could be up to a third of that, 80 years. 6 years dreaming. Nature does not waste energy, but it is in some way that the psyche is in an ongoing dialogue. And that dialogue through the venues of feeling and energy systems and dreams and symptoms is going on constantly within us. It's not navel gazing to pay attention to that dialogue, because the more you neglect that, the more ignorantly, that is to say, without knowledge, you are engaging people in the outer world. And that's why the single best thing you can do for relationships is to bring a more thoughtful and conscious person into your relationships with your children, your partner, your society, and so on.
So You mentioned there about the daimon, and there's a great book I've got at home here. It's called The Soul's Code by your colleague James Hillman, who's now passed. The first part of this question is, how do you distinguish between what's coming from the daimon and what might be coming from a more superficial place? And the second thing is, I've heard you say something that really hit me, that we live a larger life by asking larger questions. So, are there any questions that you find helpful for helping your clients sort of get onto a path towards a larger life?
Yes, and that's an excellent question. It's the question of discernment. We're full of voices. We have these little clusters of energy. I'm just pointing physically here to get some image in your mind that are complexes. A complex is a neutral word. It's like a structure and it's charged with energy. So, you have positive complexes. You like music, let's say, or you like dance or art or something like those are positive complexes. If every time you approach music, you were given electrical shock, you would have a negative complex toward music. You would never want to hear it. So the complex is just a function of having had a history, of having been here. The question is, what is the little script or story that gets attached to that cluster of energy? And what's its valence, positive or negative here? And what does it make you do? Or what does it tend to keep you from doing with your life? And much of the time we're living daily life, we think consciously life in service to complexes of some kind. And therefore it's often a provisional and adaptive life, not what is wanting expression through us, as we've already talked. But again, underneath this is the real question: what is wanting expression through you? And then comes the issue of discernment, because those voices chatter all the time. I used to have a client years ago who would come in, a very thoughtful woman. She said, "Let me tell you what the kids have been doing this week." And what she meant by that is these clusters in her that were acting out in the course of the day, right? And producing sometimes positive, sometimes negative consequences. So discernment is something that takes time. If you received a dream today that's said to you in so many words or images, now I want you to move to Belfast. I would not advise you to move to Belfast, because you might do that in good faith. Or let me move to Galway. I'll move there. Well, you do that, and then you're saying, well, it's really Cork you're talking about here. You get there. Well, it would tend to be literalized by the ego if it's naive. It might be saying what you need is movement in your life. It doesn't mean necessarily changing your outer domicile. But the key is to recognize the motif that is there. And I've often asked people of a certain behavior or a certain decision, okay, now the question is, what is that in service to inside of you? And the first responses, frankly, will be the complexes defending themselves. There'll be rationalizations. Well, I'm doing it for this reason, or after you realize you have to, this situation, all of which may be true, but it's not the real reason. You can't trust your first response. You have to stay with it, sit with it. The two things I've learned as a psychoanalyst, I hate them both, is patience and powerlessness. I can't fix anyone, and I want to get it done right away, but both are beyond my capacity, anyone's capacity. You have to sit with this over time until it begins to move, and you can assist it, you can abet it, or you can run from it. That's up to you. But something needs to find, ripeness is all, said Hamlet. So, and by the way, one of the best definitions of a complex comes from Brother Hamlet, who said, once in a while, resolution, that's our desire to do something. Resolution is sicklied over with the pale cast of thought and lose the name of action. In 1604, that's a perfect description of the power of the invisible force to reach up and grab you and take hold of you. So, to ask the question, what is that in service to? Because it could be a decision you made. It's really an old codependence, and codependence is a defense against one's feeling of powerlessness in the face of the powerful other. It's always about a power inequity. They have it, you don't, that sort of thing. Or it could be a fear avoidance pattern, not necessarily a major crime, but that's the motive it's serving. It's not really developmental because one of the things we always have is our rationalizations for the status quo. Well, I take care of the kids. Yeah, I'll take care of the kids, you know, but do this too. I don't have the money for it. Okay, you don't have the money, but you can find a way. If something's important for you, you have to find a way and still honor your outer commitments as ethically as you can. So discernment, I think, is a lifelong process. It means sorting and sifting, sorting and sifting. And people say, oh, but that's so time consuming. All right, don't do it. Then you're on automatic pilot. That's the point. Or you're living whatever is the noisiest voice inside of you. That if you choose to do that, that's your choice. But that's a received life. That's not a generated life. And it doesn't leave a good residue behind for others, frankly. And if you're going to do it over time, it means having the courage and discipline to say, where's this coming from inside of me? And what is that serving here? And I've often said too of decision junctures in one's life, and we always have them. Which path is the path of enlargement for you, psychospiritually, and which is the path that will diminish you? Perhaps be the safe path, but it diminishes you. And usually you know the answer to that question immediately. If you don't know, you keep asking it. It'll come to the surface. It'll come to you in 72 hours while you're driving on the motorway, or it'll come to you in a dream. But your psyche will get back to you. That I have complete conviction because I see it all the time. So it's a discernment process, and something inside will tell you if you're opening the dialogue with honesty and a willingness to hear whatever wishes to be expressed.
Um, Whenever I first heard you say that in your conversation with Andrew Huberman, it's been ringing in my ears ever since. And when I'm doing something, I'm asking myself, to what is this in service to inside of me? And it's very difficult not to give an honest answer to that question if you're asking it sincerely. But it's such an important question. Like, what is the actual reason for this? So it's a really powerful thing to contemplate. Um, you
Let me
pers
for one moment and just say the reason for that is many times it was our adaptations that were necessary in childhood, to shut down something in you to meet the expectations or demands of your environment and not stir the waters, you see. So what was once protective could now be constrictive. That's the point. So that's why we sometimes have to outgrow our old behaviors and our old, internal sort of self-protection system to step into the larger journey. But that's what stands in the way frequently of the larger path. And by larger, I don't mean in terms of career advancement or something, but maybe the risk to leaving career A because career B offers you a deeper sense, perhaps, of challenge and satisfaction for you. I mean, that it takes courage to do that. You risk a lot financially and so forth. So I'm sorry to interrupt you, but just wanted to insert there that often what stands in the way can be something that was good in the past or necessary in the past, but you've outgrown it now.
for sure. The example that comes to mind for me is I I went back to do a postgraduate in psychology whilst running this project I'm doing right now. And this would have been about maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And as I was doing the degree and running a business at the same time, it was very, very stressful, very just like quite a difficult time just to try and manage everything at once. So I said, you know what? Maybe the best thing for me to do would be to just leave the degree and take a leave of absence and focus on growing the business. And after I'd done that, for months after, I would be rationalizing to myself that, that it was the right thing to do and all the rest. But something inside, there was a major protest inside that wouldn't leave me alone. And the basic pattern in my life that I've noticed is that the more I need to rationalize, the more kind of logic I need to sort of tell myself about a decision, the less likely it is really true on that deeper level. And I've heard someone say like rationalize rational lies, and I think there is definitely something to that. Um,
Mhm.
the
Yes.
so, something I'm also curious to ask before we finish up. Um, am I right in saying that you had a very close brush with mortality in 2022?
Yes. Yes. I considered a extra privilege to be here. I developed two cancers, and they were treated with radiation and surgery and chemotherapy. And then a year after the treatment was over, my spine started dissolving in the lumbar area, and I was in excruciating pain. In fact, I'm sitting here in pain, but it's manageable now. And so I had to have two very risky spinal surgeries. So the good news, I'm walking and so forth. In fact, I actually walk a mile a day in addition to domestic walk around the house and so forth. So it was pretty perilous. And the surgeon told my wife that I had about a 50% chance in that last operation of not emerging from it or be permanently crippled. And so I'm full of gratitude, and life is rich, in the meantime. So I feel I've been privileged by that. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't easy on my wife, obviously. And we moved into a retirement center 2 years ago because my longevity was pretty shaky, and we wanted a structure and so forth for her as she is older too. And so we're glad we did. It's curtailed travel, which is why I'm grateful to be able to use the internet for teaching, which is still my calling in life, and so forth. So, yes, I must say, it wasn't, I mean, all of this was unexpected to say the least, but it wasn't that the brush with mortality was unexpected. If you've been thoughtful, and I was from childhood on, and I don't mean this in any morbid way, that, the guy with the hourglass and the scythe can show up at your door any day, right? So, what are you waiting to live for? When you're a child, you have no choice but to sort of wait until you can find your own capacities and callings and so forth. But, you know, the virtue of mortality, which is a sentence you don't hear very often, is that it does bring to you the fact that this is a finite journey and you're here a short time. No matter how long it is, it's a very, very short time. And spend your life and energy in places that matter to you. Obviously, as children, we have to do a lot of adaptation and exploration. That's true for various stages of our life. But when you find whatever really seems to call you, give yourself to it, and you'll feel that sense of reciprocity. If you're doing what's right for you, there's reciprocity to it. It's like any relationship. If it's real, the currents go both directions in a sense. So I've had the opportunity for a lot of podcasts like this and another book in the last 2 years, and I'm already into the next one. And I'm just grateful. And, Jung said once, when people's religion is tied up with fear of judgment, he said their life will be governed by fear and anxiety. He said when it's addressing wonder, he said their life will be full of gratitude. So I'm grateful, and I think gratitude is as good as one can get in the sense of saying, with all life's hardships and suffering, It's still rich and wonderful. And what is most wonderful is your engagement with what we'll call the mystery, however you want to define it, and your relationship to it and what it calls you to. Those are the things that make life so profoundly meaningful for you.
Beautiful, beautiful. I was going to ask a follow-up to that, but you answered it anyway, so it's all good. Jung said that life is a brief pause between two great mysteries.
Mhm.
In your view, given how much you've thought about this and the life that you've lived, what do you view as the purpose of our existence? What are we here for? What is the point of all of this?
Well, believe it or not, it's a question I often think about. And I don't really have a satisfying answer. Jung reports a similar question when he was on a safari in Africa, and it was around his midlife, and it was 1920s. And he said, one morning I got up before my party and walked out onto the veldt, and he said I could see these great streams of wild beasts going by as they'd done for millennia, and the cry of scavenger birds in the distance and so forth. And I asked myself, he said, I felt as if I was the first person on the planet. I felt wholly alone with the mystery of being. And he said, at that moment, I also had a sense of why I was here. He said it was to bring consciousness to brute beauty. The lichen that's growing on the picture of the cliffs of Moher there behind me are modes of being as well. And maybe they have a certain kind of instinctual consciousness of which we're unaware. We have one that also separates us from nature. And we ask this question in the pointed way that you just did. We're more likely to be neurotic and split on that than they are. They know that their job as a lichen on the side of the cliff is to be a lichen on the side of the cliff, and that's sufficient. There's something in us that has a divine yearning to know questions like that. And what I can abide today that I felt was intolerable as a child was the mystery of it all, the uncertainty. But I've come to recognize my own limitations, the limitations of my brain and my imagination. So anything I grasp or believe today can easily be supplanted by tomorrow by different questions, larger questions, and different instruments, different information. So I'm not attached to the outcomes in the way I would have been as a young person. So I can tolerate that mystery, which is not passivity. It's active engagement because the question still matters to me. And by the way, if I figure that out for you, I'll get in touch with you quickly. I won't let a secret. But the last thing I want to do is proclaim for other people. They have to find their own unique path through the many thickets of choice to arrive at a place where they feel this life I'm living with its hardships and heartbreaks is a rich and wonderful life. And all I can do is be grateful for that and address it with as much conviction and sincerity as I can mobilize on a daily basis. And then I think you're living the life you're supposed to live. But simple as that may sound, it's very complicated. We get ambushed by our fears and by our histories and by the intimidation, by the magnitude of the task and the pressures of the external world. And it's easy to lose that connection to the voice within us that tells us who we are.
For sure, for sure. And maybe just an interesting note to wrap up on. Something else that I've heard you say that I think is really simple but really powerful. I think it's shut up, suit
You got
up,
to show
and
up.
show up. Can you maybe
Yes, yes,
expand on this?
yes, sure. I that came to me when I was in the hospital. I had so much pain, and when I came home, I had so much pain. It was just horrible. Um, and it's easy to get wrapped up in that for obviously other understandable reasons. But I also again reflected in the large history of things and the great picture. there are worse sufferings and injustices and so forth. So I said to myself, shut up. That doesn't mean I'm saying that to someone else. I'm saying to my own noisome self, that the part of me that wants it to be easy, shut up. There are people who don't have a roof over their head. There are people whose children are dying. There are people who don't have food. You're lucky. Be grateful. So shut up. Again, speaking to myself only. Secondly, suit up. Prepare. Work at it. Do what you need to do to bring your best self to the task, whatever it may be. And thirdly, just do your best. Not show off, show up. Just do the best you can. I love those mellifluous words of Samuel Beckett, who said, failed, fail again, fail better. So, if we fail, fail better next time. And when you do that, you've taken your life on and you're not whining and you're not looking for someone to step in and fix it for you or explain it all away for you. You're engaged. You know life is real and you're living your journey. And as best we know, that's why we're here. What it's in service to remains the mystery. If I could explain it, it would no longer be the mystery.
That last one reminds me of a quote from Rilke. It's something like the purpose of life is to be defeated by greater and greater things. Sort of ties in. But Jim, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you today. The time has flown. Um, where would you send people after this conversation? Is there a particular book you think might be relevant to what we've covered today, or anywhere you might send them online? You've got a great documentary I watched this week, Soul Hill, which is basically about the modern kind of crisis in masculinity and the struggles of modern men. Yeah, where would you send people after this interview?
Well, now you ask a question I don't know how to respond because each of them says something about different aspects of life. The middle passage and sort of living in the second half of life are two books that address the midlife transition, basically. But Swamplands of the Soul deals with the difficult times we're thrown into of loss and depression and so forth. I think probably a starting place would be living an examined life. That raises 21 questions, and say addressing these questions will give you that examined life that Socrates described as so important for us. The latest book, and it just came out this week, actually, is called Living with Borrowed Dust, which was a byproduct of that precariousness on the health front, and is a line taken from the poet Stanley Kunitz, who wrote on his 80th birthday, I think it was, I've only borrowed this dust. So what is borrowed, you have to return, of course. So it's about asking some of these large questions. So they all address these things from different angles. So wherever you start's wherever you start, and may it lead you to something else, which is even more interesting, I hope.
Yeah, well, Jim, I'm really glad you answered those summons at age 35. You've been a force of nature and you continue to put great work out into the world. So I want to wish you the best going forward, and I'll be following along.
Well, it's very kind of you, and it's been a privilege to talk with you.